Hello, I'm Jon Sopel, host of the Newsagents podcast, the former North America editor of the BBC, and the author of Strangeland, available in all good bookshops now. So let's get on to the questions. This is from Astronomer 5978. Hi John, why is politics becoming so partisan? The US is the extreme, but I don't think it's much better here. How can it regain some decorum? I think it's a really interesting question. I think that maybe there's always been a very strong partisan element to politics in the US and the UK because we've both had two-party systems for a very long time. You know, in the American situation, it's been the Democrats and Republicans, Labour and the Conservatives here. And even when they have sort of broadly been in the same space politically in terms of the differences over economic or foreign policy, you exaggerate the differences for elections. But it's true that maybe we are seeing a much more kind of move to, I wouldn't say the extremes necessarily, but people are moving further left and further right. And you can look at, you know, the Democrats, the kind of the liberal agenda that some Democrats are kind of most active to pursue against the right of the Republican Party, the MAGA movement, and there is not a lot of common ground between them. I think what we've seen in British politics, and maybe, you know, at the UK general election in July, there wasn't that much extremism from the Labour Party, which had tacked towards the centre, and Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party, which had also kind of tried to show a sort of kinder face, as it were, maybe except with the issue of immigration and sending illegal immigrants to Rwanda. But what you've seen is that the people, the voters, have moved to a bit more to the extreme because you had 4 million people voting for a hard right anti-immigrant party, Nigel Farage's Reform. You saw Jeremy Corbyn being re-elected as an independent, having been a left-wing leader of the Labour Party. So I do think that there is a tendency that maybe people are thinking, if I want a solution to today's problems, you've either got to go to the far right or you've got to go to the far left. And I just think that that reflects a failure of conventional politics to satisfy what people want, and that's you see it over the economy, you see it over immigration, and you saw it in Britain in the general election, and you've seen it in November in the election in the United States. Right, this is from Crazy Tomatillo 1876. Have you ever been afraid in any of the stories you've covered, e.g. in conflicts or wars? And the second question, favourite person to have interviewed over the years? I would love to tell you that I'm so bloody brave. I've never been frightened of anything ever in anything I've done. But there have been occasions in war zones or in places of conflict where you do feel a bit scared. And I remember being on a front line in northern Afghanistan, and there was this place called Kunduz, which was the last town that the Taliban held, and this is in 2001. And we'd been watching B-52 bombers coming over and strafing the hillside where the Taliban were. And we were standing on this front line about a mile from the Taliban position. And there was low cloud cover, which meant that the B-52s weren't flying over. And you could see the kind of the vapor trails of these planes as they came. And you could see on very clear days the bombs actually falling. And they look like they're going to land on your head because they drop them from a long way off. But of course, they're gliding towards the targets. And the Taliban had started firing back. And suddenly there is sand spitting up next to us. And you think, oh, that's machine gun fire. Probably a good idea to move out of the way now. So, yeah, there have been times when I've been frightened, and there are times when you have been deeply disturbed by things you've seen in, natural disasters or whatever else. Favourite person to have interviewed? I'm not going to say a person. I'm going to say the people who are honest with you. And that is the privilege of the job you do, where you're talking to people in incredibly difficult circumstances, a natural disaster, a war zone, or somebody who's been through something unspeakable, and them trusting you enough to engage with you to discuss those issues. And that for me is always the most moving bit. And I remember being in the tsunami in Sri Lanka. This guy hadn't eaten for days. A food lorry had come into what had become a makeshift refugee camp, and they're throwing out packets of rice, dry biscuits, and this guy who hasn't eaten for days opens the packet of biscuits and offers me a biscuit before he's taken one. I've eaten. And I just think that sort of generosity of human spirit still kind of manages to move me and stay with me. Now, Del Griffiths, how would you propose dealing with the widespread misinformation that exists in the world of social media? God, if only I had a magic wand, because that's what it needs, it feels like, at times to deal with it. And I think it's a huge problem. I don't have any views on how you vote, how your mates vote, or any of it. But what I do want is that when you guys go into a polling station, you're basing your judgment on good information. And I think it is a real threat to democracy that so much misinformation is out there that it's sometimes impossible to know what is true and what is false. And I think that, I've been a journalist for 40 years now, and I simultaneously think there has never been a more challenging time to be a journalist, but there's never been a more important time. And we're never going to be the fourth emergency service, fire, ambulance or police. No, I'll have a journalist, please. We're never going to be that. But I think that the role of journalism in a democracy is hugely, hugely important. And I think that, that we've got to stay in the fight and can't just say, oh, well, it's all become so ghastly, I'm leaving social media alone. I mean, I think that, government needs to regulate some of this stuff. I think that the tech companies need to have more responsibility for what they're putting on there, but I don't think it's an easy battle, but it is a battle that needs to be waged. Right, here's hardware question. Which MP, living or dead, that you have met have you admired the most and why? Golly, that's a difficult one. I've met a huge number of them, in the last 50 years. I suspect I've met more or less all the major politicians. I suppose the politicians that get things done and who have the craft and the political agility to do things and who've changed things a bit. And I think the two big figures in my lifetime would be Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. Very different politics, very different view. And you can argue over the rights and wrongs of the changes that they made, but they did succeed in changing Britain in fundamental ways. Thatcher, who was very firmly pro-European and signed the Single European Act, which set up the single market of the European Union, was a great one for labour reform, flexible labour markets, attracting inward investment to this country. And after a period where, there were 3 million people unemployed, the UK economy came back. And Tony Blair, for some of the changes that he made, the Good Friday Agreement that brought peace to Northern Ireland, the Sure Start schemes and other things, I think he also had a profound effect in the way we lead our lives. No politician is perfect. No politician leaves the stage and you can just say, well, let's all agree that they were absolutely fantastic. But I do admire the politicians that get things done and get legislation passed and have got a clear idea of what they want to do. And that doesn't mean I agree or disagree. There was an awful lot of Margaret Thatcher I profoundly disagreed with. But I think that her ability to change things and the success she had as a politician was remarkable. And I think the same about Tony Blair as well. I love this next question from Parker Pen Car Keys. I'll let others ask the political questions. What's your favourite meal? So I spent 4 years as the BBC's Paris correspondent. Actually, a lot of French food is really disappointing in the sense that, it's a very limited range. But if you were to sit me down in a good Parisian brasserie at a time when oysters are on the menu, and half a dozen fin de Claire oysters with the sort of shallot vinaigrette, and then a really good steak frite with good Dijon mustard and a crisp green salad, and then some fine French cheese after that with a good bottle of claret, I say, yes, please. That sounds absolutely fabulous. Now, I could go more sophisticated and go into sort of, other food stuffs that from around the world. I mean, that's the joy of traveling around the world, is you eat a lot of, ceviche in Peru. Can't beat it. But just as a bog standard, if I was on death row and I had to choose what would be my last meal, I think I'd be sitting down in a French brasserie and eating as described. This is from Hackney Cricket. Hi, John. Thanks for dropping in. Any predictions for 2025 that you can share for global politics? This is a mugs game. I hate the prediction business because it just makes you look like a total blithering idiot. I hope that there will be peace and trust and love and happiness to all mankind. I suspect I will be reporting on the other bits of it. So I'm not going to make a prediction about whether there's going to be peace here or peace there, or whether struggles will continue. There are obvious things that you can predict on about Ukraine and Middle East. There are things that you can predict on Donald Trump's tariffs. But I mean, look, we know what the kind of parameters of those sort of things are, and the rest of it will just react to what happens. This is from Traditional War 7360. Hey, John, I know you spent a lot of time in the US. How will Trump's presidency change the UK's outlook in the next 4 years? Thanks. I think that's a really interesting question, because I think, the UK, even when we were in the European Union, had a kind of complicated relationship with straddling the European Union and the United States. And often we were the translator for what was happening in America to Europe and vice versa. So the Europeans would say, to London, can you find out what Washington is thinking by doing this particular thing? I wonder whether, if Donald Trump, and it goes back to the previous question, if Donald Trump does introduce his tariffs on the European Union that he's threatened, and on China, which he has said out loud in the last few days that he is definitely going to do, I wonder whether Europe then finds itself drawn to China because of those tariffs, and whether there is a sort of kind of slight anti-Americanism that steps in as Donald Trump pursues a more isolationist policy in regard to the United States. We will see. I think the thing that continues, and I was endlessly asked when I lived in America about the state of the special relationship between Britain and the US, and frankly it's something that the British obsess about and the Americans don't think twice about, except when the British Prime Minister is in Washington and politicians, the US politicians, have it written on their hands, remember to say the special relationship is in very good condition, because that's what the British want to hear. There are some areas where I think the special relationship is real, and I don't think the next 4 years will change that unless something remarkable happens. And that is in the fields of intelligence sharing, of national security and defence, where really large numbers of British servicemen and women are integrated in American units and vice versa. There is a lot of interoperability in the defence space. And in terms of, America's spy agencies, they rely very heavily on our spy agencies. They rely very heavily on GCHQ in Cheltenham to do a lot of the listening. So I think that is the bit that will continue. But I think the bits around trade might see some rather tense exchanges. And of course, if there is going to be a trade deal post-Brexit, which still hasn't happened, between the US and the UK, what the contours of that will look like. My own view is that Donald Trump will say a trade deal is far more important to you, Britain, than it is to us, America. So these are the terms of it. And then what does Britain do about that? This question is from that lad. How do you manage to keep the voices on a 3-person podcast balanced? E.g., if Lewis is on a runaway rant, what's the mechanism to bring him in and allow you or Emily to get a viewpoint across? Well, I mean, that lad, you have identified the central problem of doing this podcast. I mean, Lewis Goodall never bloody shuts up, does he? Goes on and on and on, drones on, loves the sound of his own voice. Now, actually, seriously, I think that why the podcast works is that if we were all talking across each other, it would be unlistenable to. It would just be a cacophony. And so often you hear that in studios where there's a three-way debate and you've just got three people shouting and you think, oh, please, well, just shut up, somebody. I think with us, we are interested in what each other has got to say, and we tend to come to things from different angles, and we'll have had a discussion beforehand about what we think are the key points to bring out. And I think it's important that with a podcast, you have got space. I mean, it's not, it's not like a 5-minute discussion, a segment on a conventional TV or radio program where everyone's trying to get their points in as fast as you can. We can let things breathe. We can let arguments develop. And I think that's really good for the listener because, we're figuring it out as well. And so the podcast, when it's at its best, I think, is like a really good conversation that you sit down in a pub, that you've got three people sitting down there having a pretty interesting conversation. You think, oh, that's interesting. Oh, I hadn't thought of it like that. Oh, that's interesting. And so, let people make their points and then take the piss out of them afterwards for being so bloody long-winded. And this again relates to Mr. Lewis Goodall, and it comes from Jared Osborne. Hey, John, is Lewis's hair as luxurious in real life as it is on camera? Asking for a friend. Lewis Goodall's hair is ridiculous. And not as ridiculous as Donald Trump's, which is overly coiffed, and not as ridiculous as Boris Johnson's, which is distinctly undercoiffed, but it is a luxuriant mane of hair to behold. And we have had a question and answer before about what is his hair care routine. And frankly, I mean, Lewis Goodall is always 4 hours late for absolutely bloody everything. I'm surprised it's not longer than that, how much time he spends doing his hair. No one asks about my hair care routine, which is very simple. It gets wet, it gets dry. Final question. This is from Software Buyer 2015. In the interest of transparency, can you assure us no money has changed hands for this? I thought I was getting 15 million. I thought there was going to be a huge cheque paid into my Cayman Islands bank account. Are you telling me I've done this for free? I have done this for free. But Strangeland will cost you a few quid at your bookshop or online or wherever you get your books. I'd love you to go and read it. Thanks. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.